Hey everybody, my name's Kyle and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. You know, nostalgia is often a strong draw when it comes to entertainment, and one of the best examples of this is the hit TV show Stranger Things on Netflix. Season 2 was just released, and as the story continues, audiences find themselves right back in the mid-80s alongside the show's young characters. And of course, having an 80s child star like Winona Ryder playing one of the adult characters also goes a long way toward lending the show even more nostalgia points. For me, one of the things about the show that resonates the most is the teenage characters at the center of the story. I mean, obviously characters are a huge draw for audiences, but for me, watching this show, that was my 1984. I was their age at that time. I was a 13-year-old kid playing Dungeons and Dragons with my friends, riding my bike everywhere, clueless about girls but crazy about Star Wars and this new movie called Ghostbusters. And although we didn't realize it then, 1984 was a huge year for music. Did you realize that in the entire year there were only 5 #1 albums on the Billboard charts? Michael Jackson's Thriller came out the year before, and it ended up being the top-selling album of both 1983 and 84. 15 weeks into the year, it was knocked out of the top spot by the Footloose soundtrack, which was #1 for 10 weeks. Huey Lewis and the News managed to take the top spot with Sports for 1 week before Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA came out. But the boss was no match for Prince. When Purple Rain topped the charts in the beginning of August, it stayed there for the rest of the year. And those are just the albums that hit #1. 1984 also saw a ton of other iconic records released, like 1984 by Van Halen, Tina Turner's Private Dancer, Chicago 17, Ride the Lightning by Metallica, The Unforgettable Fire by U2, Make It Big by Wham, plus the debut albums from The Smiths, the Red Hot Chili Peppers, and Bon Jovi. So with all those huge musical milestones all taking place in a single year, there were bound to be a number of other noteworthy musical releases in 1984 that are easily overlooked. So with that in mind, I'd like to explore some of the lesser-known stories of that epic year. Maybe not Stranger Things per se, but things that were too good to be forgotten. So, like that hit TV show, let's start with Chapter 1, Which One's Pink? In 1983, Pink Floyd released The Final Cut, which would end up being their final album with David Gilmour and Roger Waters both in the band. 1984 saw those two rock icons both releasing solo albums within 1 month of each other. Gilmour was first out of the gate with About Face, which was his second solo effort. It's an album that sounds a little dated today, but it was still packed with a lot of great songs, several of which were co-written with Pete Townsend of The Who. Of course, Roger Waters is no slouch either when it comes to high-profile musical collaborators. When he released his first album as a solo artist a month later, The Pros and Cons of Hitchhiking was highlighted by none other than Eric Clapton on guitar. Waters wouldn't officially quit Pink Floyd until the following year, but 1984 was a huge turning point in one of rock's greatest ongoing feuds. Moving on to Chapter 2, People Are People. In both 2016 and 2017, Depeche Mode have appeared on the nomination ballot for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And although they did have a few bouncy hits in the early 1980s, it was their 1984 album that truly defined their musical direction and legacy. Some Great Reward was the 4th album from this legendary electronic band, and it contained their first US hit single, People Are People. The dark edge of that song was a huge contrast to their feel-good UK hit, Just Can't Get Enough, and other songs on the album took on even more controversial subjects. To this day, Master and Servant and Blasphemous Rumors remain fan favorites, even if they weren't huge chart-topping hits. And again, for many Depeche Mode fans, this 1984 album is where they got started. Chapter 3, A Legend Reborn. Jamaican reggae icon Bob Marley died in May of 1981. He was already an international star, but his was an image that would only continue to grow larger and larger in the decades after his passing. The primary musical vehicle for his ongoing legacy, though, was his 1984 greatest hits album, Legend. Just 3 years after his death, it may have seemed presumptuous to title this best of compilation with such a lofty label, but of course that album went on to become one of the best-selling greatest hits albums of all time. Next year it will reach a milestone of 500 weeks on the Billboard Top 200 Albums charts. a legend indeed. Chapter 4, The Purple Protege. So, as I mentioned earlier, Purple Rain made Prince into one of the biggest stars of 1984. But Prince didn't do it alone. I mean, yes, there was his band, The Revolution, of course, but the music charts also saw the success of several of his musical proteges. Those included his film nemesis, Morris Day and the Time, as well as the scantily clad female singing group Apollonia 6. But for me, the most exciting member of Prince's musical entourage was percussionist extraordinaire Shelia E. After backing Prince during the Purple Rain recording sessions, Shelia E went on to release her own debut EP that same year. The Glamorous Life contained just 6 songs, but together they packed enough punch for an entire album. The title track was a 9-minute tour de force showcasing Shelia E's considerable talent on the drums on a song that Prince wrote just for her. She's gone on to record half a dozen more solo albums since, but 1984 was the year that she first stepped out from Prince's shadow. Finally, Chapter 5. This is Making Sense. Now, no doubt 1984 was a huge year for music on the big screen. Purple Rain and Footloose were huge hits, both in theaters and in record stores. That same year also brought us Breakin', Streets of Fire, The Cotton Club, Oscar winner Amadeus, and who could forget Rick Springfield in Hard to Hold? You're welcome. But there were 2 more movies in 1984 that were true game changers when it came to the genre of music films. One changed the way concert films were made, while the other one made fun of them. Now, if you think about it, there was probably no better band than Talking Heads to take the idea of a concert film and elevate it into something that transcends mere music video. Paired with visionary director Jonathan Demme, Talking Heads turned Stop Making Sense into the new template for so many concert films that followed it. This is a film, a real film, that it just pulls you in right from the opening scene of David Byrne's manic solo performance of Psycho Killer. I can only imagine the parody that this film might have inspired if This Is Spinal Tap hadn't been released just 1 month earlier. Spinal Tap was a movie that was so funny because it was so true, even if it was entirely fiction. This was essentially the movie that invented the mockumentary genre. It has inspired countless movies and TV shows that have followed, and in many ways it serves as a sort of cautionary tale for all the rock bands that have risen to popularity since. And as if a movie wasn't enough, the fictional band even recorded a soundtrack album featuring full versions of all the songs heard in the film. And they even did a live tour to promote it. Of course, This Is Spinal Tap is infinitely quotable, but the one line that gets referenced more than any other has to be, "These go to 11." Which of course brings us back to the mysterious girl with strange superpowers and the group of misfits determined to protect her from the forces of evil. In many of the same ways that This Is Spinal Tap was a love letter to rock and roll, Stranger Things is a celebration of a time when the darkest scenarios that we could imagine came from tattered Stephen King paperbacks or worn-out VHS tapes of sci-fi and horror movies. If you grew up in that time period, you can relate on a very personal level. But as they say, everything old is new again. So here's hoping that Stranger Things Season 3 gives me an excuse to do another video only for 1985. Then we could talk about the debut albums from Tears for Fears, Whitney Houston, Sting, Suzanne Vega, movies like The Breakfast Club and The Goonies. But I'm getting ahead of myself here. After all, I've got to get back to 1984. I'm about halfway through Season 2 right now. And even though it all feels so familiar to me, I have no idea how this story ends. And that's the best kind of story. So, until next time, my name's Kyle, and this is Track by Track, music reviews, news, and commentary. Thanks for watching.